On the evening of December 9th, 1944, a colonel named Oscar Koch stood up in front of General George Patton and told him something that nobody else in the Allied High Command was prepared to say. The room was in Nancy, France, in the headquarters of the Third Army. The men around the table were Patton's senior staff, his operations officer, his logistics chief, his chief of staff. They had spent the preceding weeks planning an offensive that was supposed to begin on December 19th, a drive through the Siegfried Line toward Frankfurt that would, if it succeeded, put the Third Army into Germany before Christmas. Koch told them that the offensive would not happen as planned, not because of anything the Allies were going to do, because of what the Germans were about to do, in the Ardennes to the north, against the weakest sector of the Allied line, with forces that no other Allied intelligence officer had correctly identified as offensive rather than defensive. The room received this in silence. Then Patton stood up. He said, "We'll be in a position to meet whatever happens." 7 days later, at 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire across an 80-mile front in the Ardennes. The largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940 had begun. The 106th Infantry Division, which had been in the line for less than a week, was surrounded and would surrender 8,000 men, the largest mass capitulation of American forces in the European theater. The First Army's headquarters was in chaos. Eisenhower was stunned. Bradley was stunned. Schaeff was stunned. Patton was not stunned. He was already on the phone to Eisenhower, describing 3 specific plans for turning the Third Army north and driving into the German southern flank. Plans his staff had been developing for the preceding 7 days, since the evening Koch had stood up in Nancy and told them what was coming. This detail, that Patton had contingency plans ready before the battle began, appears in every serious history of the Ardennes campaign. It is usually presented as evidence of Patton's military genius. It was that, but it was also something more specific and less discussed. It was evidence of what one intelligence officer had done correctly, while every other intelligence officer in the Allied High Command had done it wrong. The question that the Koch story poses is not whether he was right. He was right. The question is how he was right, what he was doing that the other Allied intelligence officers were not, what principle he was applying that allowed him to see a German offensive that remained invisible to everyone above him in the chain of command. The answer is a single distinction that Koch had internalized and that his superiors had not. The distinction was between what an enemy intends to do and what an enemy is capable of doing. Every Allied intelligence officer in December 1944 was asking the same question about the German buildup east of the Ardennes. What do the Germans intend to do with these forces? And the answer they gave, based on their reading of German capabilities, German morale, and German strategic logic, was that the Germans intended to defend. The war was effectively over. The Reich was being bombed to rubble. The Soviets were on the Vistula. Rational analysis said that Germany had no offensive capability left. Koch was not asking what the Germans intended. He was asking what they were capable of. Oscar Koch had been Patton's intelligence officer since North Africa. He was not a famous man. He was not the kind of officer whose name appeared in newspapers or whose photograph ran alongside dispatches from the front. He was a staff officer, a man whose job was to sit behind the lines, read reports, study maps, and tell his commander what the enemy was doing and what the enemy was about to do. The job required a specific kind of mind, systematic, skeptical, comfortable with uncertainty, resistant to the institutional pressure that pushes intelligence assessments toward whatever conclusion the chain of command wants to hear. Koch had that mind. He had developed, over 3 years of working intelligence problems, from North Africa through Sicily through France, a principle that he articulated explicitly in the manual he would write after the war. The principle was simple. An intelligence officer's job was not to assess enemy intentions. Intentions were invisible. Intentions lived inside the enemy commander's head and could not be observed, only inferred. And inferences about intentions were almost always contaminated by the analyst's own assumptions about what a rational enemy would do. Capabilities were different. Capabilities were observable. A tank division on a rail line was a fact. An ammunition dump in a forward position was a fact. A fuel depot being filled was a fact. None of these facts told you what the enemy intended to do. All of them told you what the enemy was capable of doing. And an intelligence officer who mapped capabilities rather than intentions would not be surprised when the enemy did something that the analyst had decided was irrational. In November 1944, Koch had begun seeing facts that his colleagues were classifying as defensive preparations. Of 15 known German tank divisions in the western part of Germany, only 5 were in contact with Allied forces. The other 10 were somewhere. Their last known positions were on Koch's map, but their current positions were unknown. Unknown meant not destroyed, not disbanded, not in transit to the Eastern Front. Unknown meant present and unlocated. An intelligence officer who was tracking capabilities rather than intentions would treat 10 unlocated tank divisions as a problem requiring explanation. Koch treated them that way. He requested additional night photo reconnaissance missions. Not over the front lines, over the railroad marshalling yards and highway intersections deep behind the German lines, the infrastructure through which a large force would move if it was going somewhere. The photo interpreters who analyzed the results reported several hundred trains per day moving west from Frankfurt. Tanks were being loaded. Ammunition was accumulating. Fuel was being stockpiled in dumps that a defensive force had no particular reason to fill. Koch added each of these to his map. The picture that emerged was not a picture of an army preparing to defend. It was a picture of an army preparing to do something. The something was not labeled. Koch did not know what the something was. But the capability was observable, and the capability was building, and the sector across which it was building, the Ardennes, thin line, under strength, held by divisions that were either brand new or recovering from the Hurtgen forest, was the sector where a large armored force, if it was going to attack, could achieve the most with the least resistance. Koch briefed Patton on this picture in a series of periodic reports through late November and early December. Patton read the reports. Patton asked questions. The relationship between the two men was, by December 1944, one of the most productive command intelligence partnerships of the war. A commander who wanted to know what the enemy could do, rather than what the enemy intended, and an intelligence officer who had built his entire professional method around exactly that question. On December 9th, Koch brought the picture together in a single briefing. By that point, the picture had a specific shape. The unlocated tank divisions had not reappeared on the Allied front elsewhere. The ammunition and fuel accumulation in the Ardennes approaches had continued. The 6th Panzer Army, the strongest German formation remaining on the Western Front, had been identified in the assembly area east of the Eifel, opposite the thinly held American line. Koch did not tell Patton that he knew the Germans were going to attack. He told Patton what the Germans were capable of doing. He told Patton where the capability was concentrated. He told Patton what would happen if the capability was used. Patton stood up. "We'll be in a position to meet whatever happens." Here is a number that does not appear in most histories of the Battle of the Bulge. 43. That is how many separate intelligence reports, assessments, and warnings, from sources ranging from ultra-intercepts to prisoner interrogations to aerial reconnaissance to resistance reports, identified German military activity in the Ardennes region in the 6 weeks before December 16, 1944. 43 reports, from 43 different sources, describing a picture that, assembled correctly, pointed toward the largest German offensive on the Western Front since the fall of France. Every one of them reached the Allied intelligence system. None of them produced a warning at the SHAEF level. The failure was not a failure of information. The information was there. The failure was a failure of the framework through which the information was being processed. A framework built on assumptions about German intentions that were so deeply embedded in the Allied command's thinking that contradictory evidence was not evaluated on its merits. It was evaluated against the assumption, and when it conflicted with the assumption, it was explained away. The assumption was this: Germany is losing and knows it. A rational German high command would not expend its last strategic reserves in an offensive that could not possibly achieve its stated objective. Therefore, the German buildup east of the Ardennes is not offensive preparation. It is defensive preparation, a last-ditch effort to shore up a line that the Allies are about to break. This was a reasonable assumption. It was also wrong. General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's chief of intelligence at SHAEF, had seen the buildup. He had been sufficiently concerned to brief Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, about the possibility of a German attack. Smith had sent Strong personally to warn Bradley. Bradley's response has been preserved in the historical record. He said, "Let them come." Strong returned to SHAEF. The warning was noted. Nothing changed. The mechanism of the failure is visible in Strong's own post-war account. He wrote that intelligence officers who reported pessimistically about German capabilities were regarded as defeatist, as men who did not believe the end of the war was in sight and who were therefore failing to read the situation correctly. The institutional pressure was not toward accuracy, it was toward optimism. The Allied command in December 1944 was planning offensives, not defenses. An intelligence assessment that required defensive planning was an assessment that disrupted the institutional momentum. Koch was immune to this pressure for a specific reason. He worked for Patton. Patton was not an optimist about enemy capabilities. He was, if anything, a professional pessimist about them. A commander who had built his entire operational method on the assumption that the enemy would do the worst possible thing at the worst possible moment, and that the only adequate response was to have already planned for that thing before it happened. Patton wanted to know what the enemy could do. He did not particularly care whether the enemy would rationally choose to do it. This created a specific kind of freedom for Koch that Strong and the other Allied intelligence officers did not have. Koch could report what the picture showed without filtering it through what his commander wanted to hear. Patton wanted the unfiltered picture. He made this explicit in his interactions with his intelligence staff. He wanted capabilities, not intentions, and he wanted them reported regardless of how inconvenient the implications were for whatever offensive Third Army was currently planning. The 43 reports that failed to produce a SHAEF warning failed because the men receiving them were answering the wrong question. They were asking, does this evidence confirm that Germany intends to attack? And the answer, from their analytical framework, was no, because a rational Germany would not attack, and therefore the evidence must be describing something else. Koch was asking, does this evidence show that Germany is capable of attacking? And the answer, from his map, was unambiguously yes. The difference between those two questions was the difference between surprise and preparation. It was also, on December 16th, the difference between the First Army's chaos and the Third Army's readiness. Colonel Benjamin Dixon was the First Army's chief intelligence officer. He was not a careless analyst. He was not an incompetent one. He had been watching the Ardennes sector with growing unease through November and December, and his periodic intelligence summaries, the documents that went up the chain from his desk to First Army headquarters, had included language that, read carefully, described exactly what Koch's map was showing. On December 10th, 6 days before the attack, Dixon issued an intelligence estimate that stated, in language that his superiors would later quote back to him with some embarrassment, that the enemy is capable of a spoiling offensive in the Ardennes to disrupt any Allied attack. Capable. The word was there. What happened to Dixon's estimate illustrates the specific mechanism of the failure. The estimate reached the First Army staff. The staff read it. The staff noted that Dixon had previously issued estimates that turned out to be wrong, a normal occurrence in intelligence work, where the analyst is always working with incomplete information, but an occurrence that had damaged Dixon's credibility in a command that was not inclined to hear pessimistic assessments in the first place. The estimate was filed. The planning for the Allied December 19th offensive continued. Dixon went on leave to Paris on December 14th. He was in Paris when the attack began on the 16th. The contrast with Koch's situation was not a contrast of analytical ability. Dixon had seen the same picture Koch had seen, or close to it. The contrast was institutional. Dixon worked in a command that had decided the war was nearly over and that treated intelligence assessments pointing the other direction as defeatism. Koch worked in a command that explicitly wanted to know what could go wrong. The difference was Patton. This is the part of the Koch story that most accounts underemphasize. Koch's method was real and his analysis was correct, but the method and the analysis required a command environment in which they could produce action rather than file space. An intelligence officer who correctly identifies a threat and whose assessment is ignored has not in any practical sense succeeded. Koch succeeded because Patton acted on what he was told. Patton's decision to begin contingency planning on December 9th, 7 days before the attack, while the Third Army was still planning its own offensive toward Frankfurt, was not obvious. It required accepting that a major German offensive was possible at a moment when every other senior commander in the theater had concluded it was not. It required diverting staff attention from an active offensive plan to a contingency plan for a scenario that Patton's superiors were not taking seriously. Patton made that decision because he trusted Koch. The trust had been built over 3 years and 3 theaters. In North Africa, Koch's assessments of German armor movements had been accurate when other sources were not. In Sicily, his reading of the Italian defensive situation had allowed Patton to move faster than the terrain seemed to permit. In France, his identification of the gap in the German line after the Normandy breakout had given Patton the intelligence he needed to drive the Third Army further and faster than any other formation in the Allied advance. By December 1944, Patton had learned something that most commanders never fully internalize. The intelligence officer who tells you what the enemy can do is more valuable than the intelligence officer who tells you what the enemy will do. What the enemy will do is an opinion. What the enemy can do is a fact. And in the specific situation of the Ardennes in December 1944, a situation where the enemy did something that rational analysis said he would not do, the commander who had been briefed on capabilities rather than intentions was the commander who was ready. Dixon's estimate had the right word in it, capable, but the word was surrounded by qualifications, buried in a document that a skeptical command had decided in advance was defeatist. Koch's briefing had the same word at its center, capable, and it was delivered to a commander who had spent 3 years learning that capable was the only word that mattered. The briefing on December 9th lasted approximately 30 minutes. Koch had prepared a map. It was the same map he had been maintaining since mid-November, updated daily, marked with the known positions of German units, the estimated positions of units whose location had become uncertain, the identified ammunition dumps and fuel depots, the rail lines carrying westbound trains that the night photo reconnaissance had been tracking. He walked the room through it methodically. The 10 unlocated tank divisions were still unlocated. This was itself a data point. A tank division that disappeared from its known position and did not reappear anywhere on the Allied front had not ceased to exist. It had moved somewhere that Allied reconnaissance had not yet found. 10 tank divisions represented somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 armored vehicles, a force large enough that its absence from the observable battlefield required explanation. Koch's explanation was the Ardennes. The rail traffic told part of the story. Hundreds of trains per day, westbound from Frankfurt, carrying equipment that the photo interpreters had identified as consistent with armored unit movement. Tanks on flat cars, artillery pieces, fuel in quantities that exceeded what a defensive force in a stabilized position required. The prisoner interrogations told another part. German soldiers captured on the Ardennes front in late November and early December, men from the new Volksgrenadier divisions being fed into the line as replacements, had described, in the fragmentary way that frontline soldiers describe things, an unusual density of activity behind their own positions, movement at night, units they did not recognize, equipment being moved forward in quantities that seemed disproportionate to the defensive mission their officers had described. Each of these data points, taken individually, could be explained away. Rail traffic could be logistics resupply. Unlocated tank divisions could be in transit to the Eastern Front. Prisoner accounts of unusual activity could be the normal confusion of men who did not have access to the operational picture. Every Allied intelligence officer who had seen fragments of this picture had offered exactly these explanations, and the explanations were not unreasonable. Koch had stopped offering explanations. He had started asking a different question. If you assembled all of these data points, the unlocated divisions, the rail traffic, the fuel accumulation, the prisoner accounts, and asked not what they individually meant, but what they collectively made possible, the answer was specific. They made a major offensive possible. In a specific sector, against a specific part of the Allied line. The specific sector was the Ardennes. The specific part of the line was the 8th Corps front, 80 miles of rough forested terrain held by 4 divisions, 2 of which were exhausted from the Hurtgen forest, and 2 of which had been in the line for less than a week. Koch told the room this. He did not tell them the Germans were going to attack. He told them the Germans were capable of attacking, that the capability was concentrated opposite the weakest point in the Allied line, and that if the capability was used, the Third Army's planned December 19th offensive would be disrupted or canceled. He then told them what a German offensive through the Ardennes would require the Third Army to do in response, the axis of advance, the approximate forces needed, the time required to reorient from the eastward offensive toward Frankfurt to a northward counterattack into the German flank. This was the part of the briefing that was unusual. Koch was not just identifying the threat, he was pre-solving the response. An intelligence officer who identifies a threat and stops there has done half the job. The other half, the half that required Koch to think like an operations officer rather than an analyst, was to tell the commander not only what the enemy could do, but what the friendly force should do about it, specifically enough that planning could begin before the threat materialized. Patton stood up. He told his chief of staff to begin the contingency planning immediately. He told his operations officer to identify 3 specific axes along which the Third Army could turn north. He told the room that the Frankfurt offensive would continue as planned, and that the contingency planning would proceed in parallel. We'll be in a position to meet whatever happens. The briefing was over. 7 days later, everything Koch had described began to happen. On the morning of December 16th, Patton was at his headquarters in Nancy when the first reports arrived from the Ardennes. The reports were fragmentary. The communications from the front were breaking down almost as fast as the front itself. The 8th Corps command posts were being overrun. The telephone lines were cut. The radio traffic was a mixture of accurate reports and confused ones from units that did not yet understand what was happening to them. What was clear by mid-morning was that something large had begun, that it was not a local spoiling attack, and that the American line in the Ardennes had broken in multiple places simultaneously. Patton already knew what it was. He had known for 7 days what it could be. The briefing on the 9th had given him the framework. The framework told him that what he was hearing on the morning of the 16th was not a surprise. It was the capability that Koch had mapped, finally being used. That afternoon, Eisenhower called a conference at Verdun for the 19th. In the interval between the 16th and the 19th, Patton did something that the other senior Allied commanders were unable to do. He shifted from reaction to action while everyone else was still processing the shock of the attack. He told his staff to accelerate the contingency planning that had been running since the 9th. He identified 3 specific axes along which the Third Army could turn north into the German southern flank. He began moving units into positions from which the turn could be executed. He also made a phone call that has been preserved in his diary. He called Koch. The call was brief. Patton told Koch that the situation was developing as the briefing had described. Koch confirmed that the German forces now in contact were consistent with the order of battle he had been tracking. Patton asked how long before the German momentum would peak. Koch gave an estimate. Patton said, "That's when we hit them." The Verdun Conference on December 19th is one of the most documented moments of the European War. The photographs of it show Eisenhower at the head of the table, surrounded by the senior Allied commanders who had gathered to address the crisis. Patton is in the photographs, lean, decorated, visibly impatient. Eisenhower opened the meeting by telling the assembled commanders that he wanted to see only cheerful faces. He said the situation should be regarded as an opportunity rather than a disaster, a chance to destroy German armor in the open rather than fighting it behind the Siegfried Line. Patton's response to this framing has been quoted in every account of the campaign. Eisenhower asked what Patton could do and when. Patton said he could attack with 3 divisions on December 22nd, 3 days away. He had, he said, made the necessary arrangements before leaving Nancy that morning. The room went quiet. 3 days to turn a full army 90 degrees and drive north into a German flank. The logistics alone, the fuel, the ammunition, the route planning for columns that had been oriented east toward Frankfurt and now needed to point north toward Bastogne, would have taken most headquarters a week to organize. Patton was saying 3 days. Eisenhower's reaction, recorded in multiple accounts, was skepticism. He told Patton not to be fatuous. A 3-day turnaround was not possible. Patton told him the orders were already on the way. He was not exaggerating. The contingency planning that Koch's December 9th briefing had made possible had been running for 10 days. The 3 axes that Patton had identified were already being staffed. The units that would execute the turn had already received preliminary movement orders. When Patton stood up at Verdun and said 3 days, he was not proposing a plan. He was describing one that was already in motion. The Third Army attacked on December 22nd, exactly as Patton had said. The corridor to Bastogne was opened on December 26th. The 101st Airborne, which had been surrounded and besieged since the 19th, was relieved. The German southern flank, which had been advancing without serious opposition since the 16th, found the Third Army in its path. The counterattack that stabilized the Ardennes and ultimately broke the German offensive began on a timeline that was possible for one reason. A colonel in Nancy had looked at a map in early December and asked the right question. The 72 hours between December 19th and December 22nd were the most compressed feat of operational logistics the American Army produced in the European War. The Third Army had been oriented east. Its supply lines ran east. Its fuel depots were positioned for an eastward advance. Its artillery was registered on eastward targets. Its route plans, its radio frequencies, its liaison officers with adjacent units, all of it was built around a direction of movement that was now irrelevant. In 72 hours, it turned north. The mechanics of what happened in those 72 hours are documented in the Third Army's after-action reports with the specific precision that American military record-keeping produced. Approximately 133,000 vehicles moved on roads that had not been planned for this traffic, in weather that reduced visibility to near zero and turned secondary roads into ice. Supply convoys moved at night without headlights. Artillery battalions were displaced from their registered positions and moved to new firing points. Division commanders received orders, confirmed them, and began executing before the higher headquarters had finished issuing them. The word that appears most frequently in the accounts of American officers who participated in the turn is prepared, not surprised, not improvising. Prepared. The preparation had begun on December 9th, when Patton told his staff to begin the contingency planning. It had continued through the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th, 6 days during which the Third Army was simultaneously planning its Frankfurt offensive and planning the Ardennes response that Koch's briefing had made necessary. The route plans for the northward movement had been drafted. The fuel allocation had been calculated. The sequence of unit movements had been worked out. When the order came on the 16th, the plan existed. This is the specific, practical consequence of what Koch had done on December 9th. He had not prevented the German attack. No amount of intelligence work on the Allied side could have prevented the attack. The decision to launch it had been made in Hitler's headquarters, and it was beyond the reach of anything Koch could influence. What Koch had done was give his commander 10 days of preparation time that no other Allied commander possessed. 10 days is a specific number with a specific value in military planning. In 10 days, a staff can draft route plans that would otherwise take 48 hours under pressure. In 10 days, a logistics officer can pre-position fuel and ammunition at points that would otherwise require emergency resupply during the operation itself. In 10 days, a division commander can brief his regimental commanders on the contingency so that when the order arrives, it is not the first time they have heard the concept. The 4th Armored Division, which would lead the relief of Bastogne, had received its preliminary orders before the German attack began. Its commander, Major General Hugh Gaffey, had been briefed on the possible northward reorientation while his division was still planning to drive east. When the order came on the 16th, Gaffey's staff was not starting from scratch. They were finishing. The 26th Infantry Division, which would cover the 4th Armored's flank during the relief operation, was in the same situation. The 80th Infantry Division, which would anchor the eastern end of the Third Army's northward advance, had received its preliminary movement orders 2 days before the German attack started. None of this appears in the popular accounts of Patton's relief of Bastogne. The popular accounts describe Patton's 3-day promise at Verdun as a feat of command will, a general who refused to accept that the impossible was impossible and drove his army to achieve it. This is not wrong. Patton's will was real, and its effect on the men beneath him was real. But the 3-day promise was not primarily a feat of will. It was a feat of preparation. And the preparation had been made possible by a colonel named Oscar Koch, who had looked at a map on December 9th and told his commander what the map made possible. Not what the map said the enemy intended, but what the map showed the enemy could do. The Verdun Conference produced one exchange that has not received the attention it deserves. After Patton's 3-day promise, after the skepticism and the confirmation that the orders were already moving, Eisenhower asked Patton a direct question. He asked how Patton had been ready. Patton's answer was brief. He said he had the best intelligence officer in any American command. The answer was not false modesty, and it was not credit sharing for its own sake. It was a specific attribution, the kind that commanders rarely make in public, and that this one was making at the most important military conference of the European campaign, in front of every senior Allied officer in the theater. Patton understood, with the precision of a man who had been thinking about military operations for 40 years, exactly what had made the 3-day turnaround possible. It was not his personal courage, though he had that. It was not his operational intuition, though he had that too. It was the 10 days of preparation that Koch's December 9th briefing had produced. The 10 days during which the Third Army had been running 2 plans simultaneously, while every other Allied headquarters was running one. The Bastogne relief operation arrived on December 26th. The 4th Armored Division's lead elements broke through the German encirclement at a point south of the town and opened a corridor that the surrounded 101st Airborne immediately used to bring in supplies and evacuate wounded. The corridor was narrow. It would be widened over the following days, but it existed, and its existence was the operational turning point of the Ardennes campaign. General Anthony McAuliffe, who had commanded the Bastogne garrison through 9 days of encirclement and had replied to a German surrender demand with a single word that became the most quoted response of the European war, described the relief in his after-action report with the professional restraint of a man who had been close to the edge and knew it. He wrote that it had been close. It had been close not because the 4th Armored was slow. It had been close because the German offensive had moved faster in the first days than anyone except Koch had anticipated it could. The gap between what Koch had predicted and what had actually happened was, in the event, smaller than the gap between what everyone else had predicted and what had happened. This is the measure of the December 9th briefing. It had not been perfect. No intelligence assessment is perfect. Koch had correctly identified the capability in the sector. He had not known the exact timing, the exact axis, or the exact scale of the first day's breakthrough. The briefing had given Patton a framework, not a forecast. The framework proved accurate in its essentials. There was a major German offensive. It came through the Ardennes. It required the Third Army to turn north. And the preparation that the framework had enabled was sufficient to execute a response on the timeline that Patton had promised at Verdun. The German offensive was halted and rolled back over the following weeks. By the end of January 1945, the bulge had been eliminated. The German strategic reserves, the armor and fuel that had been hoarded for the operation, had been expended. The Siegfried Line, which the Ardennes offensive had been designed to make inviolable, was crossed by Allied forces in February. The campaign's final accounting showed approximately 100,000 German casualties, 800 tanks destroyed or abandoned, and the complete exhaustion of Germany's last significant offensive reserve in the West. On the Allied side, approximately 75,000 American casualties, the heaviest American losses of the European War. Koch's name does not appear in the casualty lists. His name does not appear in the popular histories the way Patton's name appears, or McAuliffe's name, or the names of the men who held Bastogne and the men who relieved it. He was a staff officer. Staff officers do not appear in the popular histories. What he did appears in the timeline. 3 divisions attacking on December 22nd, Bastogne relieved on December 26th, the German offensive contained before it reached the Meuse. Every day of that timeline runs through the briefing room in Nancy on December 9th, where a colonel stood up in front of his commander and told him what the enemy was capable of doing. Not what the enemy intended, what the enemy could do. After the war, Oscar Koch wrote a book. It was not a memoir, it was a manual, a systematic account of how intelligence work should be done, written by a man who had spent 3 years doing it correctly and who wanted the principles he had applied to survive in a form that could be taught. The book was called G2, Intelligence for Patton. It was published in 1971, 26 years after the events it described. It received limited attention outside the professional military intelligence community. The central argument of the book was the distinction Koch had been applying since North Africa: capabilities, not intentions. Koch wrote that an intelligence officer who focuses on enemy intentions is building his analysis on a foundation that cannot be observed. Intentions exist in the enemy commander's mind. They change with circumstances. They are concealed by deception and revealed only when the enemy acts, at which point the intelligence assessment has already failed its purpose, which is to predict action before it occurs. Capabilities are different. Capabilities are physical. A tank division requires fuel. Fuel requires storage. Storage requires infrastructure. Infrastructure can be photographed, measured, and counted. A tank division that has been photographed at a railhead, whose fuel dumps have been located, whose ammunition accumulation has been documented, that division's capability is a fact, regardless of what its commander intends to do with it. Koch wrote that every intelligence failure he had studied, from Pearl Harbor to the Ardennes to every other strategic surprise in the history of modern warfare, shared a common structure. The information had been present. The capability had been observable. The failure had occurred at the point of interpretation, where analysts had filtered observable facts through assumptions about enemy intentions and explained away the evidence that contradicted those assumptions. The 43 reports that had not produced a SHAEF warning before December 16th were, in Koch's analysis, not a failure of collection. They were a failure of interpretation. The right question had not been asked. The capable was there. The question was never asked. Koch's book did not make him famous. He had spent his career in the specific invisibility of staff work, the kind of work that enables commanders to succeed and receives credit only when a commander is generous enough to give it, as Patton had been at Verdun. Patton was dead by the time the book was written. He had been injured in a car accident near Mannheim in December 1945 and died 12 days later, 11 days after the war in Europe had ended, in a hospital in Heidelberg, from a broken neck sustained when his staff car collided with a truck on a German road. He had survived 4 years of combat and died in a peacetime traffic accident in the country he had helped defeat. Koch outlived him by decades. He died in 1970, a year before his book was published. The book's argument, Capabilities Not Intentions, has become, in the decades since its publication, something close to a foundational principle of professional military intelligence. The intelligence failures that Koch identified as structural have recurred with sufficient regularity that his analysis reads less like a historical account then a prediction. The same pattern: information present, capability observable, intentions assumed, surprise achieved, has appeared in every major intelligence failure since 1944. Koch would not have been surprised. He had watched it happen in real time, from inside the Allied command structure, in the weeks before December 16th. He had watched 43 reports fail to produce a warning. He had watched Dixon's estimate, with the right word in it, capable, get filed without producing action. He had watched Bradley tell Strong, let them come. He had drawn his conclusions and written his book and died the year before it appeared. The conclusions were correct. They remain correct. They will remain correct as long as intelligence organizations face the specific institutional pressure that had shaped the Allied command in December 1944. The pressure to confirm what the leadership wants to hear rather than report what the evidence shows. That pressure does not change. The only defense against it is the discipline Koch had applied. Ask what the enemy can do, not what the enemy intends. Map the capabilities. Report them regardless of the implications. Leave the intentions to the enemy. He had learned this somewhere between North Africa and France, in the specific education that comes from being wrong enough times to understand why you were wrong. By December 1944, he had learned it well enough to be right when everyone else was wrong. There is a photograph in the Patton Museum at Fort Knox. It shows the 3rd Army staff assembled in Nancy in the autumn of 1944. Patton is at the center, tall, decorated, the posture of a man who has been photographed many times and knows how to stand for a camera. Around him are his senior officers, the Chief of Staff, the Operations Officer, the Logistics Chief, the Artillery Commander. Koch is in the photograph. He is standing to the left, slightly back from the center group, wearing the expression of a man who is not particularly interested in being photographed. He is not tall. He does not have the theatrical quality that the camera finds in Patton. He looks like what he was, a staff officer, present at the edge of the frame, doing work that does not photograph well. The photograph does not tell you what he did. The timeline tells you. December 9th, Koch briefs Patton. Contingency planning begins. December 16th, German offensive opens. 3rd Army contingency plans are already running. December 19th, Patton promises 3 divisions in 3 days at Verdun. December 22nd, 3rd Army attacks north. December 26th, Bastogne relieved. 5 dates: 10 days from the briefing to the attack. 17 days from the briefing to the relief of a besieged garrison that had been told to hold and had held because help was coming faster than the German command had believed possible. The German command had made the same mistake that the Allied command had made. It had assessed American capabilities through the lens of what seemed reasonable. What seemed reasonable was that turning a full army 90 degrees in 3 days was not possible. What seemed reasonable was that the road to Bastogne would be open long enough for the German encirclement to be consolidated. What was actual was Koch's map and Patton's trust in it, and the 10 days of preparation that the map had produced. Benjamin Dixon, the 1st Army's intelligence officer whose December 10th estimate had the right word in it but had not produced action, spent the rest of his career in the professional obscurity that attaches to men who were right in ways that were ignored. He gave interviews after the war. He described his analysis in documents that went into the archives. His estimate is cited in the official histories as evidence that warning had been available. He is remembered, when he is remembered at all, as the man who saw it coming and was not heard. Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's chief intelligence chief, wrote his memoirs and described the failure in terms that were honest about its mechanism. He said the intelligence was there. He said the institutional pressure was toward optimism. He said this combination produced surprise on December 16th that should not have been a surprise. He was right. He had also been part of the system that produced it. Koch was not part of that system, in the sense that mattered. He was inside it. He wore the same uniform, held the same rank structure, operated under the same chain of command. But the specific command environment that Patton had created for him was not the same environment that Strong and Dixon were operating in. Patton wanted capabilities. He got capabilities. The system delivered what the commander demanded of it. This is the lesson that Koch's book was trying to teach. Not a technical lesson about intelligence methods. A structural lesson about what intelligence systems produce when commanders demand confirmation versus what they produce when commanders demand accuracy. Patton demanded accuracy. He got a warning that nobody else in the Allied command received. He got 10 days of preparation. He got the ability to stand up at Verdun and make a promise that his staff had already made possible. The men of the 101st Airborne who held Bastogne for 9 days, who ate cold rations and fired artillery ammunition that was running out, and told a German general that his surrender demand merited a single unprintable word. Those men did not know about Koch's briefing. They knew about the relief column that arrived on December 26th. The relief column was there because of the briefing. The briefing was there because one intelligence officer had asked the right question. Not, what does the enemy intend? What can the enemy do?